The first shovel of dirt felt heavier than it should have. Not because the ground was frozen, it wasn't. Autumn had barely begun. The soil was still soft from the last rains. No, it felt heavy because of the eyes watching me. I drove the shovel into the earth again anyway. The blade cut through the dark soil beside the chicken yard, and I lifted another load out of the growing pit. Behind the fence, my hens clucked nervously, shifting across the dusty ground as if they sensed something unusual was happening. Across the road, 3 men stood near the general store porch, watching. The same 3 men who had watched nearly everything I'd done since the funeral. I ignored them. The shovel bit into the earth again. Another scoop. Another. After the 5th shovel full, one of the men called out, "You digging yourself a cellar there, Mrs. Carter?" Laughter followed the question. I straightened slowly, wiping sweat and dirt from my brow with the back of my sleeve. The man who had spoken was Jacob Turner, a rancher with a wide hat and the easy grin of someone who had never once worried about surviving winter. "No," I answered calmly. The 3 men leaned closer, curious now. "What then?" Turner asked. I rested the shovel against my shoulder. "A chicken coop." That earned a full roar of laughter. Turner slapped his knee. "A coop," he said. "You're digging a hole for chickens?" The other 2 men nearly doubled over. I let them laugh. They'd been laughing since spring, since the day my husband died. Tom Carter had been a quiet man, but he had worked harder than anyone in the valley. When he bought our small piece of land 2 years earlier, people said he was foolish. The winters here were brutal. Blizzards could bury barns. Livestock froze where they stood. But Tom had believed we could build something. And for a while, we had. Then the fever came. It moved through the valley like a silent predator. 3 people died that spring. Tom was one of them. I buried him myself behind a cabin. After that, the laughter started. Not cruel laughter, at least not always. But the kind that said a young widow had no business trying to run a homestead alone. Most people expected me to leave, to sell the land, to go live with relatives back east. Instead, I stayed, and I started digging. The hole beside the chicken yard was already nearly 3 feet deep now. I stepped back into it and drove the shovel down again. Above me, Turner leaned against the fence. "You know chickens don't live underground, right?" he said. "I know. You'll drown them when it rains." "Not if I build it right." Turner tilted his head slightly. "Build what right?" I paused. Then I pointed to the hill behind the yard. "The ground stays warmer below the frost line," I said. The men exchanged looks. Turner squinted down at the pit. "You saying the dirt keeps heat?" "Yes." He chuckled. "Lady, chickens freeze because winter's cold." "That's exactly why," I said. They didn't understand. Most people didn't. But Tom had once explained something to me while repairing our root cellar. The deeper underground you went, the steadier the temperature became. Not warm, but stable. Protected. If I built the coop partly underground, with thick earth walls and a proper roof, the cold winds wouldn't reach the hens. And if the temperature stayed just above freezing, they might keep laying eggs. All winter. Turner shook his head slowly. "Well," he said, pushing away from the fence. "Good luck with your dirt chickens." The men walked away laughing. I climbed out of the pit and kept digging. By sunset, the hole was 5 feet deep. The walls were packed hard and smooth. My hands were blistered, my back ached, and my boots were heavy with dirt. But the shape of the coop had begun to form in my mind. The floor would sit below ground level. The walls would be reinforced with timber. Above that, a low roof covered with thick earth and straw. Only the entrance and a few small windows would sit above the ground. The rest would be buried. A shelter protected from the wind, protected from snow, protected from the worst of winter. The next morning, I began hauling timber. Old fence posts, scrap boards, anything I could salvage from the barn. It took 2 weeks to frame the underground walls. Another week to build the roof. I reinforced it with beams thick enough to hold several feet of snow. Then I covered the entire structure with packed earth. By the time I finished, the coop looked less like a building and more like a small grassy mound beside the yard. Only the door and 2 small windows remained visible. The hens were suspicious at first. They clucked nervously when I guided them down the ramp into their new home. But chickens cared about one thing above all else: warmth. Within a day, they settled into the coop comfortably. And something surprising happened. The temperature inside stayed steady. Even when the autumn nights grew cold, the air inside the underground coop remained mild. Not warm, but far warmer than the open air outside. I began to feel hope. Of course, the town noticed. They noticed everything. One afternoon, Mr. Dawson rode past on his wagon and stopped beside the road. He stared at the grassy mound beside my yard. "What happened to your chicken house?" he asked. I pointed. "That is the chicken house." He blinked. "You buried it." "Yes." He shook his head slowly. "Well, I'll be damned." Within days, the whole valley knew. The widow had buried her chickens. The jokes spread quickly. At the general store. At the blacksmith. At church on Sunday. People laughed at the idea of hens living underground. But I didn't mind. Let them laugh. Because the real test hadn't come yet. Winter arrived early that year. The first frost came in October. Ice formed on the water buckets each morning. The wind began howling down from the mountains. And the temperature dropped. Inside the underground coop, the hens kept laying. Not as many eggs as summer, but enough. When the first snow fell in November, I stepped inside the coop with a lantern. Warm air brushed against my face. The hens clucked softly from their perches. And inside the nesting boxes, eggs. Fresh eggs. Outside, the valley began preparing for winter. Barns were reinforced. Wood piles grew taller. And every farmer hoped their animals would survive the storms. But chickens were fragile creatures. Most flocks stopped laying the moment winter truly arrived. And some froze outright during the worst blizzards. December came. Then January. The first real storm hit the valley with terrifying force. Snow fell for 2 days straight. The wind screamed across the plains like something alive. By the time the storm ended, snow drifts reached halfway up the barns. Roofs sagged beneath the weight. The valley turned silent and white. And in farmyards across the land, chicken coops grew quiet. Frozen quiet. But inside the mound beside my yard, the lantern glowed softly. The air stayed warm. The hens shifted comfortably on their perches. And in the nesting boxes, eggs continued to appear. Fresh, warm, alive. I collected them each morning, carefully placing them in a wooden crate beside the cabin stove. And down in the valley, something else began happening. Coops froze. Hens died. And eggs, once common as dirt, became something far rarer. Something valuable. Something people suddenly needed. Sooner or later, someone was going to notice. And when they did, the laughter would stop. The first person to notice was a boy. It was late January, the coldest stretch of winter Hollow Ridge had seen in years. The sky had that pale, colorless look it gets when the temperature falls so low the air feels brittle. I had just come out of the underground coop with a small wooden basket. Inside were 9 eggs. 9. In the middle of winter. As I stepped onto the porch, I saw a skinny boy standing near the gate, stomping his boots in the snow to keep warm. It was Samuel Granger, Jacob Turner's youngest son. He stared at the basket like it contained gold. "You got eggs?" he asked. "Yes." His eyes widened. "Real ones." I held one up. The shell gleamed softly in the weak winter sunlight. "Real enough." Samuel stepped closer, almost in disbelief. "Our hens all froze," he said quietly. I wasn't surprised. The storm 2 weeks earlier had dropped the temperature well below anything most coops could handle. Thin wooden walls and drafty roofs didn't stand a chance against that kind of cold. "How many you got?" he asked. "Enough." The boy shifted nervously. "My ma said eggs are worth near $1 now in town." That didn't surprise me either. Fresh eggs in winter were rare, even in good years. This winter was not a good year. Samuel hesitated before speaking again. "Would you sell one?" I looked down at him. His coat was too thin for the weather. His hands were red and cracked from the cold. "How many people in your house?" I asked. 5. I handed him 4 eggs. "Tell your mother to keep them warm near the stove." His eyes widened. "How much?" "Nothing." He stood there stunned for a moment. Then he nodded quickly and ran down the road toward the valley, clutching the eggs like treasure. That evening, the first knock came at my door. Jacob Turner stood outside, snow clinging to the shoulders of his coat. Behind him were 2 other farmers, the same men who had laughed when I dug the pit months earlier. Turner removed his hat slowly. "We heard you've got hens still laying," he said. "I do." "How?" "Underground coop." He shifted his weight uncomfortably. "My flock's gone," he admitted. "Most everyone's is." I knew that already. A cold winter could wipe out an entire valley's chickens if the coops weren't built properly. "Could we buy some eggs?" Turner asked. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I opened the door wider. "Come see the coop." The 3 men followed me across the yard to the grassy mound beside the chicken run. Snow had piled up along the sides, but the entrance remained clear. I opened the wooden door and stepped inside. Warm air drifted out immediately. The men stopped in the doorway. Inside, lantern light flickered against the packed earth walls. The hens clucked softly from their roosts. And the air, while still cool, was nothing like the freezing wind outside. Turner stared around the coop slowly. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. One of the other farmers crouched near the wall and pressed his hand against the dirt. "It's warm," he said in disbelief. "Not warm," I corrected. "Stable." Turner stepped deeper inside. "Ground holds heat," he said slowly. "Yes. And wind can't get through dirt." "Exactly." He looked up at the thick roof beams. "You built this yourself?" "Yes." For a long moment, none of them spoke. The sound of hens shifting in the straw filled the quiet space. Finally, Turner exhaled. "How many eggs you getting a day?" 8 to 12. His eyebrows rose. "That's more than most farms get in summer." I shrugged. "They're comfortable." The men exchanged glances. Then Turner cleared his throat. "We'll buy them," he said. "How much?" I thought about it. Eggs were worth a fortune right now. But that wasn't the only thing I needed. "Not money," I said. "What then?" "Lumber." Turner frowned. "For what?" I gestured around the coop. "This works for chickens," I said. "But it could work for other animals too." They stared at me. "You're serious?" Turner said. "Yes." The valley had lost more than chickens this winter. Several sheep had frozen during the last storm. 2 calves had died in a collapsed barn. And more storms were coming. If we build underground shelters, I continued, livestock might survive winters like this. The farmers fell silent again. Then Turner nodded slowly. "You give us eggs," he said, "and we help you build more shelters. That's the trade." Word spread quickly after that. Within days, men from across the valley began showing up at my land carrying lumber, nails, and tools. Some came for eggs. Some came simply to see the underground coop everyone was talking about. But most came because they realized something important. Winter in Hollow Ridge wasn't getting easier. And the widow who had buried her chickens had figured out something they hadn't. By early February, we started digging. Not just one coop. Several. One farmer built a buried sheep shelter. Another reinforced his barn with thick earthen walls. A third dug a partially underground stall for his remaining horses. The valley slowly began to change. And the laughter stopped completely. One afternoon, Jacob Turner leaned against the fence again, watching workers frame another underground coop. But this time he wasn't laughing. "Funny thing," he said. "What? Back when you started digging, we thought you'd lost your mind." I kept hammering nails into a support beam. "And now?" He gestured toward the men working across the yard. "Now half the valley's digging holes." I smiled faintly. Winter teaches quickly. That spring the snow finally melted. The valley looked battered. Several barns had collapsed completely. Dozens of animals had died. But Hollow Ridge had survived. And the underground shelters remained. Strong, warm, reliable. My chickens continued laying eggs long before anyone else's flock recovered. By summer, people from neighboring valleys began riding in to see the strange earthen coots.